Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And here's Henry.
Yeah, go ahead and start that. All right. I just wanted to leave this up while I gave my introduction. I came to Wausau in 1975, and I've lived in Wausau and Marathon County more than I've lived in any other place in the United States. I've lived in all 4 time zones. I've lived in New Jersey, here in Wausau, and in Arizona, of course, and in the West Coast, in the Los Angeles area. So when I moved to Wausau, I'm a retired radiologist. I went to Stanford University as an undergraduate on a full tuition scholarship, and I was fortunate enough to get a full tuition scholarship. Well, it was a full ride. They paid for my books and all the fees and housing and everything, and the tuition for me all through medical school, and including 6 months of study in Germany. So I've been very fortunate. The United States has a lot of things that it's gotten wrong. I mean, we need to admit that, and once we admit that, I think we're going to get closer to being the kind of country that we really want to be and that we aspire to be. While I was at Stanford, I had the pleasure of a fraternity brother who is James Doyle, governor of, who later became governor of the state of Wisconsin. And if you Google James Doyle, you'll see that he spent 3 years at Stanford University as undergraduate, and then he transferred to the University of Wisconsin. And my thinking is that a degree from the University of Wisconsin would be better for him in his political dreams than a degree from a West Coast liberal college. So I'm gonna stick to that. Now the Declaration of Independence. This is what the preamble says. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are their life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Stanford was founded in 1889, and it was not till 1962, over 72 years later. I was in the class of 1962. There were 3 Asians, and there were 7 African Americans. This was the very first class at Stanford that ever had any African Americans in it. It took 70 years before Stanford University admitted African American students. I had the pleasure of returning to Stanford University for my 50th reunion. I graduated in 1966, so that would have been 2016. And when I arrived there, I was just astounded, because whereas my class had 3 Asian students, Stanford had to have at least 20% Asian students. And it just boggled my mind that, from what I had experienced to what was now present, it didn't seem like the same university. I had a discussion with an African American female student there, And we got to talking, and I asked her where she lived. And Stanford has these living groups. And apparently there's an African-American living group where everybody that's in that living group, in that housing unit, is African-American. And I asked her, why would you want to do that? You know, here you are at a university. And from my perspective, as a Japanese person, I knew how Asians lived and what they thought about and what their political views were and how they behaved. And when I went to Stanford, I wanted to know how Caucasians lived. I wanted to live with Caucasians or with African Americans. I did not want to live with another Asian. And I think that's something wrong in today's university where students seek out their own kind. We ought to seek out people that are different than us. We ought to learn from each other. We ought to learn, and get to know people of other races and of other beliefs. Now that's my opinion. You may have another, and you have the right in this country to believe what you want. It's interesting that the founders of our country held that all men are created equal, and yet they had slaves. And what this means to me is that they didn't think of slaves as being human. They thought of slaves as being not people, not humans, but subhumans. And we know in today's society that we're all humans. We're all of one race. And in fact, the human race began in Africa. So in some sense, our origin is in the continent of Africa. And it was from there that humanity spread throughout the world. The next slide, please. Oh, I've got the slide. I'm not used to being in control. That's because my wife has taught me that I'm never in control. Okay, so this is really not, this is mainly my parents' story. Although I was born in a Japanese internment camp in December 31st, 1943, I'm going to be 80 years old this year on December 31st. And being 80 years old, it's unlikely that there are that many Japanese who actually spent time in an internment camp. If they were 10 years old, they would be 90 years old now. And if they were 20 years old, they'd be 100 years old. So there are very few of us left. So my parents were both born in the United States. My father was born in Watsonville, California. My grandfather's Guruchi Kanemoto, and my mother is Matsu Kimura. And my parents were both immigrants to the U.S., and my father has two older sisters. My wife, Yoshie Noda, was born in Phoenix, Arizona. Father, Impachi Noda. Mother, Ayano Harada. Parents were Japanese citizens on a vacation to the U.S. My mother was born in the United States, but her parents took her back to Japan. Her parents were really wealthy. They lived in the northern island of Honshu. They lived on an estate in which their family has continuously lived on since the 1300s. 700 years, well before the Pilgrims came to the United States. In Japan, the eldest son inherits the property once the parents die. So my sister's oldest brother inherited the property, and there was nobody living in Japan at that time, so he sold it as a golf course because it was such a large tract of land. So that land is no longer in Japan. My mother then came back to the United States before the Second World War because she had dual citizenship, so she could freely re-enter the United States because she was a citizen of the United States. It's my mother and my father. My father was a strawberry farmer in California, in Watsonville. And when he was taken to camp, he lost everything. He was a weightlifter, and his best friend, they lifted weights together. He was a bodybuilder, was the representative of the United States in the U.S. Olympics in the late 1930s. So this is Ayano Noda and Impachi, and this is on their estate in Honshu. Now, before I studied all of this to make the presentation to the seventh graders of the Wausau School District, I never knew that there was a Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 that prohibited any immigration from China. Here the Chinese built, or helped build the Transcontinental Railway from the West Coast all the way to Promontory Point in Utah. And most of that work was done by Chinese immigrants. And that's how Leland Stanford made his money, was that in the Transcontinental Railroad, the United States gave, the reason there was a race to connect the railroad was that for every mile of railroad that you built, the U.S. government did not fund any of this. The company that built the railroad got 5 miles of land on either side of the railroad. Now think of that. So a 10-mile wide area of land across the United States. The towns and cities would be built along that railroad. All that land would be owned by whoever owned the railroad. The western part of the railroad was owned by Leland Stanford. That's what made him a multi-gazillionaire in those days. Between 1910 and 1924, protective lease pressured the legislature, the California legislature, to restrict the economic power of Japanese immigrants. And in 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law. And this is a quotation. Aliens are ineligible for citizenship, could not own agricultural property, could only lease land for 3 years, could not bequeath land to other aliens ineligible for citizenship, could not hold more than 50% of the stock in any land-owning corporation. To get around this, Asian families put titles and leases into the names of the American-born children. Then in 1920, a law was passed to make it illegal to put titles and leases in American-born children's names. In 1922, the U.S. Supreme Court decision that Asian immigrants could not become U.S. citizens. So any Asian who was not born in the United States and was an immigrant could never become a U.S. citizen. There was no path to UN citizenship. And in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act and the Immigration Act of 1924 banned the immigration of all Asians. So this is a case in U.S. Supreme Court, decision in 1922. Justice Sutherland delivered the majority decision. So Takao Ozawa applied in October 16, 1914, in the territory of Hawaii to be admitted as a citizen of the United States. He had residency continuously in the United States for 20 years. In California, he educated his American children in American schools. His family had attended American churches and maintained the use of English language. He was well qualified by character and education for citizenship, and that was conceded by the court, that he was well qualified for citizenship. The District Court of Hawaii, however, held that being born in Japan and being of Japanese race, he was not eligible for naturalization under Section 2169 of the revised statutes, and denied his petition. In 1790, the alien being a free, said that any alien who was a free white person could be a citizen. The Supreme Court said that the applicant clearly of a race which is not Caucasian and therefore belongs entirely outside the zone on the negative side of this requirement. So there was no path to Japanese, for American citizenship for Japanese immigrants or Chinese immigrants. So there was no way for Japanese, unless you were born in the United States, to ever become a citizen of the United States, regardless of how long you lived in the United States. Then we all remember the day of infamy, December 7th, 1941. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And basically this was a war based on economics. Japan, being an island nation, required, now I'm not telling you the Japanese are right to start a war, because they weren't. But the reason they started a war was because Japan, being an island nation, had no source of natural resources. And so everything, their whole economy depended upon importation. And one of the things that they required was rubber from rubber plantations in South America. And the companies in the United States were involved in keeping Japan from gaining access to some natural resources. So the aftermath of December 7th was the local authorities and the FBI began rounding up the Issei leadership. Now, there are some terms. Issei, the way Japanese count is ichi, ni, san. Ichi is 1, ni is 2, and sei is 3. So Issei, Nisei, first generation, second generation, and Sansei. I'm the third generation. I'm the second generation born in the US, but I'm the third generation in the United States. So I'm a Sansei. By 6:30 a.m., 736 first generation Japanese are in custody. Within 48 hours, it was 1,291. These men are held under no formal charges, and most would spend their years in enemy alien internment camps run by the Justice Department. Now, these internment camps were different than the internment camps that I was born in and that most of the Japanese spent their time in. These were actually prison camps. These were actually prisons, because these Japanese were felt to be active threats to the United States. The Western Defense Command was established in 1941 in December. General John D. Witt was the commander, and the West Coast was declared to be the theater of war. In December 15th, after a brief visit to Hawaii, the Secretary of Navy, Frank Knox, tells the press, now think about this quote. I think the most effective fifth column work of the entire war was done in Hawaii, with the possible exception of Norway. This despite the complete evidence of sabotage. What he's saying here is that the lack of any evidence shows how deeply the Japanese in Hawaii and the native Japanese were hiding their plans to overthrow the US government. The lack of evidence was the greatest evidence you could have, right? So it's like white is black and black is white. You don't have any evidence, but that's the greatest evidence of all. So Executive Order 9066, signed by FDR on February the 19th, 120,000 Japanese into internment camps. 68% were Nisei, so 2/3 were Japanese that were born in the United States. 33% were immigrants, Issei, the first generation. The US justification is that it was a military necessity and unsupported allegations of disloyalty, and that it was impossible to tell loyal Japanese from disloyal Japanese, just like it's impossible to tell loyal Germans from disloyal Germans. And yet there were really no German internment camps on the East Coast. FDR admitted in slip of the tongue that these were concentration camps, and the Japanese referred to these relocation centers as concentration camps. Now, in Hawaii, the Japanese were 250,000, 40% of the island's population, and were untouched by the internment program despite the presence of critical military installations and martial law in Hawaii. They simply could not put 40% of Hawaiians in an internment camp. The island could no longer function if you had 40% of the population in jail. So out of necessity, there were no internment camps in Hawaii. So here's a little girl that's getting ready to go into an internment camp. Then in February 1942, the Japanese American residents of Terminal Island, near the Los Angeles harbor, they must leave in 48 hours. So they had 48 hours to pack up their things and go. February 1942, Governor Chase Clark of the state of Idaho tells the Congressional Committee that the Japanese would be welcome in Idaho only if they were in concentration camps on the military guard. And some credit Clark with a conception of what was to become the true scenario. 1942, in March, General DeWitt issues Proclamation Number 1, which creates military areas 1 and 2. And we're going to see that on a map later, but includes the western portion of California, Oregon, Washington, parts of Arizona, while military number 2 includes the rest of these states, and that all Japanese be excluded from military area 1. And then President signs Executive Order 9102, establishing the War Relocation Authority with Milton Eisenhower as its director. Now this is a Supreme Court case. Korematsu resisted the Army's order for relocation. He challenged the Executive Order 9066, and he said he alleged that it violated Korematsu's 5th and 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under the law. The court ruling was that the order was justified for security reasons. The Supreme Court ruled that an entire race could be labeled a suspect classification, meaning that the government was permitted to deny the Japanese their constitutional rights. 3 justices disagreed. All 6 justices agreeing were appointed by FDR. Justice Hugo Black, who was once a member of the Ku Klux Klan and later became a liberal order reformer, wrote the majority opinion that the US government was able to label an entire racial class as being suspect. Here's the Bill of Rights. The Fifth Amendment states, "No person shall be held without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." The 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States, deprive any person of life, liberty, property without the due process of law, nor deny any person equal protection of the law. So both the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment were totally ignored and did not apply to the Japanese. The dissenting opinion, Justice Frank Murphy wrote that the internment program goes over the very brink of constitutional power and falls into the ugly abyss of racism. He added, "I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism. Racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. It is unattractive in any setting, but is utterly revolting among a free people who embrace the principles set forth in the Constitution of the United States." 56 years later, Fred Korematsu, who sued and lost at the United States Supreme Court, received the Presidential Medal of Honor from President Bill Clinton in 1998. So these are some headlines from publications after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. How will we rid the coast of the Japs? Free mass meeting, Union High School, Gresham, Oregon. Banish the Japs from this coast forever. Show your colors. Cut this out, paste it on your windshield, or come to the Summer Standard and get it printed in 2 colors ready to stick on your car. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Ouster of all Japs in California, near the San Francisco Examiner. Now, after the war, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there were Chinese who were at least to Caucasians indistinguishable from Japanese. Now, my wife knows that I can tell just by looking at an Asian. I can tell whether they're Chinese, Korean, or Japanese. It just, I don't know whether it's part of our genetics or what, but to us, the Asian races look different. To Caucasians, they may look very similar, but they wrote I Am American, closing out evacuation sale by a Japanese shop owner. People of Japanese descent registering for evacuation, San Francisco, April 1942. And this is them getting their belongings together on buses to be taken to the evacuation center where they will be later transported ultimately to the internment camps. San Pedro, California, 1942. The last Redondo Beach residents of Japanese ancestry leaving by truck for relocation. And this is the Assembly Center in Salinas, California, were in that area of California where there are no large number of Japanese farmers. 11,000 Japanese families had to sell their homes and businesses at an estimated loss of $3,200,000,000 in 2017 dollars. Evacuees were allowed to only take what they could carry, and even young children were given a package to take. What was not sold was left for the taking, and scavengers were waiting to take anything that was left behind. And that's what happened to my family. They could only take a few items and whatever. Of course, they couldn't take any furniture, so all that was later, taken by people after they left. This is a temporary war relocation center, and this is Santa Anita Park. And this is actually where my parents were initially taken. There's the racetrack, and their whole parking lot had temporary buildings where they were held until some initial buildings could be made at the relocation centers. So here's the military area 1, shaded area, military area 2, or the free zone. And so there are no Japanese in this area, and these are the internment camps. Gila River is there, where my parents were taken. Heart Mountain, which you saw in some of the other films, is up in Wyoming. And then there were a couple in Jerome. Crystal City, Santa Fe, Bismarck, and Missoula are where the initial prisoners who were taken, who were thought to be possible Japanese sympathizers from the West Coast that were rounded up initially. So Gila River had a peak population of 13,348. And the last day of departure was in 1945, when the last person left there. Gila River became the third largest city in the state of Arizona. There was Phoenix, and then I believe there was it Poston? I think Poston, and then there was Gila River. So you gotta love the U.S. government. The Gila River camp, and I'm going to have a map of it. The place that they chose to put the Gila River camp, Rivers, Arizona, was built on the most sacred part of the Pima Indian Reservation. It was their holy land. And the reason they chose it, and you'll see on the map later, is because the Gila River made a bend. And so 3/4 of the border of the camp was guarded by the river. They didn't have to post any guards. And there was only one small area where prisoners could escape out between the two banks, opposing banks of the Gila River. There were 500 inmates in 1942. Peak population 13,348. 155 of these were Hawaiian, Japanese American inmates. They were expected to provide their own food and water and be self-sufficient. The internees, of course, were a cross-section of the Japanese population. So they had teachers, doctors, nurses, and other personnel. My mother was 21 and my father was 23. Now, my father was a policeman and then a fireman. And I'll tell you a story about my father. He was tall for a Japanese person. He was nearly, maybe a little bit over 5'11", and he was a weightlifter. He could lift his body weight with one arm. I have seen him, even when I was growing up, he could take a 100-pound sack of rice in his left hand, 100-pound sack of rice in his right arm, and just carry them, you know. He could carry 200 pounds, 100 pounds in each arm. So he was probably the strongest Japanese in camp. And so they made him a policeman. And one day, he gets called because a husband was threatening his wife. It was domestic disturbance. And the husband had a knife. And my father thought to himself, geez, I could get killed. So he said, I'm not going to be a policeman anymore. I'm going to become a fireman. And the reason he became a fireman, and you'll see this when we get the map of the camp up, but the camps were partitioned up to better control the Japanese population. And as a policeman, he could cross over to other portions of the camp. And so he would eat lunch in one area, then he would go across and eat a second lunch, then he would go across and he would eat a third lunch, because he required the calories for his size and body weight. So here's Canal Camp, and here's Butte Camp, the two camps of the Gila River. And my parents were in Canal Camp. Now here's the Gila River. It makes a right bend here and it goes across. And you can see that they put that right there. And then Butte Camp was there. And so they only had to guard this area. So it made control of the camps much easier. I'm sorry that you can't see the dimensions, but there was one entrance here, and then you can go to the right or the left, and these are the long buildings that you see in the pictures of the camps. Now, what they did was they built these initial buildings, which were the buildings for the internees, and the internees had to build their churches, their schools, their recreation centers, and everything else other than for their living quarters. The living quarters were already built, but anything else the internees had to build. So you can see here that this is kind of in the middle of the desert, and there's some laundry hanging out, and you can see the size of these buildings, and then here's a guard in the tower. Barracks are surrounded by barbed wire and overseen by high wooden watchtowers. Privacy was non-existent. Evacuation tried to make the best of it by living with some degree of normalcy. Schools, libraries, sports teams, churches, and Americanization classes were created. This is the Gila River camp, the actual camp. And you can see it's a desert environment. In the desert camp, the evacuations meant extremes of temperature. In winter, it was below freezing. Summer brought temperatures to as high as 115 degrees. Rattlesnakes and desert life added to danger and discomfort. And my mother tells me about having to sweep out their living quarters every day because these buildings were not well built, the windows were not well sealed, and so the dust would get in there every day with the winds blowing. And so in the morning, her first chore was to sweep out the dust that had accumulated on the floor. So there were 36 Butte and 17 Canal residential blocks, 20 by 14 foot by 100 foot barracks. There was a mess hall, a men's latrine, a women's latrine, laundry room, ironing room. There was oil fuel tank for heating, recreational building, and then schools, churches, service organizations, beauty and barbershops manned by the internees and community services. Life in the camp. Barbed wire would surround the camps and guard would keep watch over the people. No one was allowed to leave without being shot to death. Sometimes whole families had to live in one-room cells. There was little privacy. There were communal areas to eat, do laundry, and wash. Many Japanese died of poor medical care and emotional stress. By emotional stress, they mean suicide. Everyone was constantly hungry because the provided meals consisted of bread, potatoes, and on the rare occasion, some meat, and we'll get into this a little bit later. Children would go to school and entertain themselves. Families had to share one room. Government tried to reinforce their efforts to minimize the Japanese interaction with the outside world. So they had put up signs where civilians could not approach. So this is how their toilet facilities were. They were open toilets without any kind of privacy. You were taking showers with strangers or sitting down on the pot with strangers. No partitions, you were right on the open. It was a bit embarrassing by Mike Suzuki. Standing in line in front of the latrine, standing in line for a bath. This was a shock. We got sick, we couldn't go, we didn't want to go. It was smelly, it was dirty, there was no partitions, and it was so cramped that we almost touched each other while they were sitting down doing their business. So this is a shared family room. Everyone lived in a 20 by 25 foot area with 8 inhabitants in each room. So several families could share just one same living area of 25 by 25 feet. The housing for the single internees were basically like barracks, where they had a cot for a bed, and then they had a little trunk for their personal belongings. So it's basically as if you were private in the Army. So there was food rationing during World War II because we were shipping food over for the war effort. The Emergency Price Control Act set price limits on, and you had food rations. You had ration coupons for coffee and tea and flour and all kinds of other things. Meat, cheese, fats, canned fish, canned milk, and other processed foods. Despite rationing for U.S. citizens, the internees were portrayed as having an easy life and abundant food. Let me go back here. So this is a Los Angeles Times article published in June 10th of 1943. Food being prepared at the post and relocation areas. These servings consist portions of pork, rice with gravy, cucumbers, soybean cake. This photo was published on June the 10th, 1943. It was taken June the 6th, 1943. Evening meals served cafeteria style in one of the mess halls in Poston. So this is what the U.S. public saw as the Japanese being fed, while the rest of the U.S. population was under rationing. In reality, they were served this one meal just for the photographs. Just for the photographs. So basically propaganda, right? Internees were well fed despite rationing for the U.S. The reality, when my father was working in a food warehouse, an internee begged him for rice so he could feed his family. So my dad went back there and gave him some rice. My father was starving. He volunteered to be a policeman because he could cross checkpoints and go to other mess halls. Then as a fireman, the firemen scheduled inspections during meals so they could eat in other blocks besides crossing over to areas in their own. and the Topaz internment camp in central Utah was decided that no one except children under 12 could receive milk, 6 ounces per day. Pregnant women, because their children were unborn, were not allowed any milk. I tell my wife, and this is a running joke in our family, that if my mother had good food, I would have been a genius. And so here's a catch-22, loyalty question. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty whenever ordered? Question 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America, faithfully defend the United States from any and all attacks, and forswear any form of allegiance, disobedience to the Japanese Empire or any other foreign government, power, or organization? Now, my father refused to sign this. And almost all the Japanese refused to sign it. Of the Japanese who were not born in the US were not citizens. And basically, if you signed this, you gave up your citizenship to Japan. And you couldn't be a US citizen. So you wouldn't have any country at all. So for that and other reasons besides being in a prison camp, they refused to sign the loyalty. And here's the interesting thing about the loyalty oath. If there was a way to measure the loyalty of Japanese Americans with a loyalty question, why put 110,000 Japanese in an internment camp? If merely the signing of this. Here's the catch-22, as I mentioned before. The United States Supreme Court decided that Japanese immigrants could never become US citizens. If the Japanese immigrants had forsworn any allegiance or disobedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government power organization, they would have given up their Japanese citizenship and legally would be without citizenship in any country and could never return to Japan. Death as punishment. So here are several examples. A mentally ill man in his mid-40s, Ichiro Shimoda, was shot trying to escape in 1942. He had attempted suicide twice since entering the camp, and the guard were well aware of his mental illness. Hikoji Takeuchi, a Nisei, was shot by a guard in Manzanar. The guard claims that he shot at Takeuchi and that Takeuchi began to run away from him. Takeuchi claims he was gathering scrap lumber and didn't hear the guard shout. His wounds indicated that he was shot with a bullet entering in his front rather than his back. The same year, 2 Californians were killed in an alleged escape attempt from Lordsville, New Mexico. It was later revealed that Hiroto Ishimura and Toshiro Kobata were both extremely weak on arrival, too weak to walk and much less to escape. In April 11, 1943, James Atsuki Wakasa, a 63-year-old chef, is shot to death by a sentry at Heart Mountain camp while allegedly trying to escape through a fence. It later determined that Wakasa had been inside the fence and facing the sentry when shot. The sentry would stand a general court-martial at Fort Douglas, Utah, and be found not guilty. In May 24th, 2 contrasting 1944 events. So both of these events occurred in 1944. May 24th, Soichi James Okamoto was shot to death at Tule Lake by a guard after stopping a construction truck and asking for permission to pass. Private Bernard Go, the guard, would be acquitted after being fined $1 for an unauthorized use of government property, the bullet he used to kill James Okamoto. In that same year, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was an all-Japanese regiment. It was the most highly decorated combat regiment during the Second World War, the most highly decorated combat regiment of its size. It rescued an American battalion, the Lost Battalion of the Texas National Guard. And if you Google Lost Battalion, it'll bring you to this, which had been cut off and surrounded by the enemy. Now they sent the U.S. Armed Forces in there to try to rescue the 442nd, but they were repeatedly repulsed by the Germans who were surrounding the 442nd. So the American general sent the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They suffered 800 casualties, including 44 deaths, to rescue 211 Texans. 800 Japanese were injured to rescue 211 Texans. After this, the rescue of the 442nd is ordered to keep advancing in the forest and would push ahead without relief or rest until November the 19th. One of these Texans, it's not on here, but one of these Texans returned to Texas to a hero's welcome. And one of the Japanese in the 442nd happened to also return to live in that same city. And he suffered a lot of racism for being Japanese after the Second World War. And the Texan put his arms around the Japanese and said, "This is my friend, he rescued me." And from then on, the racism stopped. So here's the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Everyone in the regiment, 3,500 men, were Japanese American. 1,000 men from Gila River served. It's the most decorated units for size and length of service in the history of American warfare. It won the Congressional Gold Medal, 800 Presidential Unit citations, 5 earned in 1 month, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses. A Distinguished Service Cross is 1 level below a Congressional Medal of Honor. They had 21 Congressional Medals of Honor, a rate greater than 1 for every 1,000 members. Now this has changed because additional Medals of Honor have been awarded to Vietnam veterans. But since Vietnam, only 20, at the time I wrote this, only 20 Medals of Honor were awarded, 20 medals in Vietnam. There were 2 in Somalia, 14 in Afghanistan, and 4 in Iraq. And they won 21 Congressional Medals of Honor. 14,000 men served. They suffered almost 10,000 casualties and were awarded over 18,000 individual medals. The unit lost so many of its men, its members were replaced 2.5 times. Here are the service members that were from the Gila River that served in the 442nd, and Kazuo Otani received the Congressional Medal of Honor. So I think I got into this earlier, but politics rather than military circumstances or concerns determined the timing of the closure of these internment camps. The Battle of Midway was on June the 4th, through the 6th of 1942, the U.S. Navy decisively defeated the Japanese Navy. After that, there was no possibility that Japan could ever threaten the United States, much less threaten the Hawaiian Islands. FDR was up for election about 18 months later. We were kept in camp for 18 months because FDR would not release the Japanese while an election was coming up. The Supreme Court decision of Kanemoto versus the United States was on December the 12th. With FDR reelected and the Supreme Court supporting FDR, FDR could close the relocation centers. The Canal Camp was closed on September the 28th, 1945, and the Butte Camp was closed on November the 10th. Now, everybody knows who Earl Warren is, right? Yep. One of the most liberal Chief Justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. Earl Warren was Attorney General of California on December 7, 1941, elected governor in 1942. As Attorney General and governor, he supported the concentration camps. His own words, "The Japanese situation that exists in the state today may well be the Achilles heel of the entire civil defense effort. The Japanese population in California is, as a whole, ideally suited to carry into an execution a tremendous program of sabotage on a mass scale." So these are quotations taken from his writings and speech. There was no way to determine the loyalty of Japanese American citizens, and that there was some racial predisposition to supporting Japan, a belief shared by many people at that time, and the invisible deadline for sabotage theory. The idea that a complete lack of espionage or sabotage by Japanese American was not an indication that there wasn't going to be any, but rather a sign that some massive coordinated activity was coming at an unknown future date. So the lack of evidence was the greatest evidence of all. A little bit of twisted logic. I think I would have gotten an F had I written that in a paper. Now here contrast Earl Warren after World War II. As his legacy of civil libertarianism grew, the seeming anomaly of his wartime support of Japanese American exclusion remained a black mark on his record. Yet despite having many opportunities to admit error, he never did so publicly. How could Warren, a principal force behind the court's unanimous attack on racism in Brown versus the Board of Education and its progeny, have ignored the racist characteristics of relocation, which was imposed only against Japanese nationals and aliens, leaving relatively unaffected people of Italian or German origin? How did Earl Warren, one of the most vigorous advocates of civil liberties in the history of the Supreme Court, come to advocate and defend the policy that constituted a wholesale deprivation of the civil rights of Japanese American? Earl Warren wrote in his memoirs, he said that he had deeply, and I think this was published after his death, since deeply regretted the removal order and my own testimony advocating it because it was not in keeping with our American concept of freedom and the rights of citizens. He then articulated his guilt, feeling in terms that for a father of 6 and a devoted family man were vividly personal. Whenever I thought of the innocent little children who were torn from home, school friends, and congenial surroundings, I was conscience-stricken. On reflection, Warren believed it was wrong to react so impulsively without positive evidence of disloyalty. Now here's Eleanor Roosevelt, and on April the 13th, 1943, she visited the Gila River camp. Look, here's a catch-22. The U.S. used the fact that Japanese immigrants had not been assimilated in Caucasian society as a reason to imprison them, when in fact it was California land laws and the 1922 Supreme Court decision, Wausau versus U.S., that prevented the assimilation and U.S. citizenship to Japanese immigrants. Chief Justice William Rehnquist wrote in 1988, both federal and state restrictions on the rights of Japanese immigrants had prevented their assimilation into the Caucasian population and intensified their insularity and solidarity. There's considerable irony, of course, in relying upon previous existing laws discriminating against Japanese immigrants to conclude that still further disabilities should be imposed upon them because they had not been assimilated into the Caucasian majority. We have no common race in this country, but we have an ideal to which all of us are loyal. We cannot progress if we look down on any group of people amongst us because of race or religion. Every citizen in this country has a right to our basic freedoms, to justice and equality of opportunity. We retain the right to lead our individual lives as we please, but we can only do so if we grant others the freedoms that we wish for ourselves. In 1988, the US government apologized formally to the Japanese and paid internees $20,000. The restitution cost budgeted was $1.2 billion in 1988. $20,000 in 1988 was $1,150 in 1942, about 2/3 the annual wage of the average employee in 1942, according to the U.S. Bureau of Census. So, as an internee, I received $20,000, and my parents did also, which was 2/3 of what they would have earned had they been out, would have earned in just 1 year had they been out. Okay.